Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. Without me is David Griscom on his honeymoon. With me is Matt McManus, another Matt. Hey there, Matt. Joining us once again. Matt is a lecturer at POLISCI at the University of Michigan. He's author of The Political Right and Equality and the co-host of the Edgelord pod, which I need to check out, actually. I wasn't aware you were podcasting, Matt. I apologize. Thanks so much for coming back and joining us.
Yeah, no, it's a real pleasure. I always like talking with you guys, and it should be a fun conversation, too, so I've been looking forward to this.
Yeah, so we're talking about Thomas Sowell, and his reputation kind of precedes himself. I say, I've been doing this for about a decade, and I don't know if there's a more requested right-wing figure to respond to than Thomas Sowell. And to be honest, there hadn't been a lot out for a while. I know Nathan Robinson did a piece last fall, and actually on Learning Economics just 22 hours ago posted a nearly 3-hour video on Sowell. So
and
it's the season.
It's part fucking one, right? Like, I'm actually going to be listening to that tonight, and I was like, God, you mean there's 6 hours of this? He was even more determined than I was to take the guy down a peg. Yeah, so it's the season for getting into Sowell. But Matt, why Thomas Sowell? Who is Thomas Sowell for folks who don't know him, and why now? Sure. Well, Thomas Sowell is an economist and a black conservative, right? And he is enormously popular, and I think that's one of the reasons why you're starting to see these really considered responses to his work. He's not as active as he once was, given that he's 93, but his fan bases continue to grow for year in and year out. You can see YouTube videos of his that have millions of hits. There's a Twitter fan page that basically just tweets out quotes from Sowell and has hundreds of thousands of followers. He just had a new book that came out recently, so even though he has slowed down a little bit, it's not like he's gone. Social Justice Fallacies, which got the red carpet treatment from pretty much all of conservative media. So without a doubt, a preeminent figure. And really, I argue in the Jacobin piece, the kind of original edgelord troll of the left, if you want, that really was a pioneer in this whole facts don't care about your feelings style of conservatism.
Right, yeah, and that is, it's funny because it just had the brainwave that he's spoken of by conservatives kind of in a way Chomsky is, another 90 plus year old, and I'll put my cards on the table. I'm pretty cynical about Sowell. I don't think his economic stuff is as academic or scholarly as it is purported. And I also think he's used as sort of as an icon for a lot of people who like to have, frankly, a black conservative intellectual champion as a sort of bluff that they aren't themselves racist. But let's get into some of Sowell's positions on this. You start off talking about his position on immigrants, which he's sort of rehashed a few times. Talk about Sowell on immigration.
Sure. Well, one of the things that's really fascinating about Sowell's work and what stamps him as a black conservative is that he's not going to deny that there's a long history of racism in the United States. In fact, he's usually pretty emphatic that the United States was a racist country for a long time. Now, saying that, that does not mean that he's necessarily opposed to, shall we say, all forms of racism. And one of the things that he consistently defends throughout this work is the value or importance of prejudice, which is a word that has a bit more of an auspicious kind of reputation in the conservative tradition. So, Burke talked about prejudice, and so did Joseph de Maistre, and they pointed out how even in the 18th century this is considered something of a dirty word or a dirty concept, but actually it's not, because it refers to a kind of common sense wisdom based upon experience that we rely on in lieu of having to do essentially case-by-case analyses of every kind of phenomena that confronts us, right? Like, if I see you and I think that you look like a dangerous man, maybe you're not, right? But it's probably better for me to avoid interacting with you. That would be kind of Sowell's defense of prejudice, right? And he says, look, in many circumstances, people relied on racial prejudices when making decisions about, say, who to hire. And his example is the Irish, throughout the 19th and 20th century. And he said, we now might accuse people who would not hire Irish workers of being racist. But actually, within Irish communities, there was a lot of problems with alcoholism. There was a lot of problem with fighting. There was a lot of problems, with various kinds of sexually transmitted diseases. So really the most sensible thing for employers to do was just rely on these prejudices to try to stigmatize the Irish rather than having to evaluate all Irish applicants on a case-by-case basis, at least until the community got its act together and was able to improve its moral standing, if you will. And that is very quintessential Sowell, right? Where he'll acknowledge there's a bit of a social problem, but then all of the onus for resolving it will be placed on the lower orders. And the argument is, look, if you want society to change, then it is not incumbent upon businessmen to stop mistreating you or to drop these prejudicial or racist attitudes. What's incumbent upon the community is to become better so that these prejudices disappear, even if they are in some ways based in unreason or unthought kind of sentiments.
What's fascinating about that is, I mean, just to go to the Irish first, like, isn't one of the lessons that, like, it was through political power and attaining investment in communities that, like, some of those things, it wasn't just, like, he says, of course, some of these things about Irish people in the 19th century must be true because you can look at Irish people at the time saying, hey, we need to do better about hygiene or whatever. And to me, that's like saying, yeah, the inequalities we see racially in America in, say, the 80s, it must have something to do with black people not pulling their pants up because you had Bill Cosby there saying that. And like, to me, am I wrong to see that as very similar arguments?
Oh, absolutely right. I mean, there's a lot of work being done recently on black conservatism, which is good because it's an understudied area. And it is a bit different than white conservatism, right? White conservatism will typically argue that America has never been a racist country, or if it has, that more or less ended in, you choose your point, 1865, 1965, 1968, right? Whatever it is, America's not a racist country now. Black conservatives tend to be more willing to acknowledge that the country was racist for a long time, at least until very contemporary black conservatives like Candace Owens, for example, right? Who seems to have been switching the tenor a little bit. But Sowell is very aligned with somebody like Clarence Thomas, right? And arguing that, look, the reality is that if you are going to want to compete in a white society, then what you need to do is be better than the people around you, which means that you shouldn't act this way. We need to have a tough on crime approach to things. We need to be very critical of people in the community who turn to drugs and alcohol and stigmatize that heavily, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And without a doubt, right, these all involve leaning very heavily on the kind of prejudices and stigmatizations that are associated because of a long history of racism with various different kind of ethnic communities. And of course, what Sowell and Thomas and other black conservatives of that generation don't want anyone to do is to intervene to actually improve the material conditions in those communities so that they will be better off, because they see this as handouts from those who are more deserving to those who are at least now undeserving.
Yeah, so the deserving and undeserving thing, let's move on to, because when I see Sowell come up, it's almost often, look at this guy saying we shouldn't raise the minimum wage, I think is often. So Sowell's position on the minimum wage. He does like to hammer that back on and on and on and on again. And you can kind of see that he's a bit worried minds are changed, because in his recent book, he's like, fuck all those economists who are now starting to say that the minimum wage is a good thing. Let's go back to the 1980s when everyone knew it was a bad thing, right? It's like, well, so much for, this commitment to hard facts, Tom. I guess that we've decided that our commitment to facticity is a flexible thing, depending upon how quickly or how closely it aligns with our ideological comportments. Yeah, and it's based on this idea that it's just like, what is leading, as for instance, like a young black kid from getting ahead is that a white capitalist can't underpay him in the minimum wage and get his foot in the door. I mean, it's preposterous, but this is sort of like, people will say, go read what is his main book? The Basic Economics. Basic Economics. And that is basically like a free market apology. That is, it's a big tome, and that's why people use it as a sort of like totem. Like, I understand economics, but yeah. Also, his unintended consequences thing. Talk about Sowell on unintended consequences. Sure. Well, this is an argument he very much picks up from F.A. Hayek, who, along with Milton Friedman, is probably the biggest single influence on his work. There are a couple of others that we could float in there. But Hayek was a brilliant guy, there's no denying it, and he's ripe for critique by the left as well. Actually, Larry Allen Busk, a great Marxist scholar, has a new book coming out, The Right-Wing Mirror Critical Theory, that does just that, and I want to recommend that to everybody for a great critique of Hayek. But basically, Hayek put forward this argument that socialism is fundamentally committed to the idea of central planning, and to a lesser extent, what you might call liberal welfarism is as well. This idea that the state should
institute various kinds of economic programs that they think will be to the benefit of the lower orders. Now, what Hayek argued, amongst other things, because his arguments are multifaceted, was that it's very problematic when we try to institute some kind of social program that might be that is proverbially to be to the benefit of the lower orders or the poor, because we can never be sure what the unintended consequences of instituting such a program could be. They very well could be bad. And so consequently, we should refrain from instituting those kinds of programs. And one of the biggest examples of this that Sowell himself, and also people like Charles Murray appealed to throughout the 1980s, was that if you institute generous kind of welfare provisions, this is going to mean that women are less likely to marry because they don't need to depend upon a man, which means you're going to have more single mothers on welfare, right? Relying on the state in lieu of a husband, right? Which is problematic to them for several different reasons, not least because it undermines various kinds of patriarchal social structures and, of course, retrenches this demand for welfare. So the argument is that this is an unintended consequence, right, of instituting various kinds of welfare programs intended to help the poor, the rise of single motherhood. Now, to be clear, it is the case, right, that whenever we institute some kind of social program, there will be unintended consequences, right? But what makes this argument conservative rather than what we might say just a neutral descriptor of something that is invariably going to happen, is the idea that we should err on the side of assuming that these consequences are invariably going to be bad, right? Because we can't be sure that if we institute this social policy, it won't be bad. Now, that's true, right? But the great progressive economist Albert Hirschman said, we could also just assume that the unintended consequences might very well be good, right? Maybe you institute a welfare program that is intended to get people off the streets. And then as a result of families being better off, more people end up going to school and more people end up going to university, right? That might not be the immediate aim of the program, but that's what ends up happening down the line, right? So it's this instinct that we shouldn't do anything because bad things might happen if we do, that makes this fundamentally, as I call it, a cynical and kind of conservative conception of unintended consequences.
And I see this as a very dominant way of responding. Yesterday, Bernie Sanders talking about a 32-hour work week. And I saw a guy who, in his bio, it's, I work with investors. Mm-hmm. And he was trying to say, well, we got to be worried about the unintended consequences might have on working people because they might not get enough, work hours or something like that, right? And it's just generally, I think all these things should be, investigated and checked into. But the motivation is kind of given away when you're only concerned about if you do something, it's going to have bad consequences. Whereas, if we, like you said, if we open up or if we put more money in people's pockets, they eat better, but they also might have more time to socialize, and so maybe mental health gets better. Who knows? Okay, so you've mentioned Hayek.
Also, sometimes conservatives are very directly concerned about what they think, not the unintended consequences, but the spillover consequences of a certain policy might be. I remember in 2020, the Wall Street Journal published something about COVID payments to people to stay home. And the overriding concern was, well, people might actually learn to like the idea that the government will just give them money to stay home or when they're unemployed. So we can't have these kinds of policies in place for too long, because if people realize that this money exists and that the government can just give them $1,500 to stay home when they're unemployed, they might decide to keep this after the pandemic. So we can't have this. It has to be cut off almost immediately, right? So it's not like there's any kind of consistency on the right there.
Yeah, and you mentioned Hayek, and just get into Sowell's, because Hayek is more explicit about democracy and the question of democracy. Sowell, again, he'll occasionally get this cred, and some people believe it when it's saying, actually, maybe it is the minimum wage that is causing inequality, and he's standing up for the little guy. But Sowell on democracy, where's he at?
Sowell is wherever the Republican Party wants him to be on democracy, right? The reality is that he is not as original a thinker as many of his proponents give him credit for. He's pretty closely trucked the Republican Party's position on any number of different issues, and when it's decided to reverse course on those issues, he's very obediently and very thoughtlessly reversed course with them. One of the examples I bring up is the war on Iraq, right? He very smugly supported it through the 2000s, talked about how, the liberals were all doubling down on Weimar-style rhetoric, right? Not wanting to do anything to stop, an emergent Nazi party. And then starting in 2010, 2011, 2014, he started saying things like, all those very foolish liberal internationalists who thought we should be nation building, clearly that was a bad idea, and then began gradually moving towards a more kind of Trumpist line on things that was much more isolationist in its tone, right? Again, just obediently and pretty thoughtlessly, following the Republican Party wherever its intimations led. And similarly on democracy, on occasion he will adopt a kind of populist line, saying that part of the problem with government programs is it's taking power away from the people, and it's putting government decision makers in charge of people's lives in a way that a truly democratic society wouldn't allow, right? But at other times, he'll switch rhetorics and just immediately kind of make a more conventional conservative claim about, for instance, why it is that people shouldn't vote if they're going to vote for Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election. And in a famous interview about this, he said, most voters are profoundly uninformed. They don't know what it is they're doing. That's why we've gotten 8 years of Obama. And so that's why they should just not vote, if at all possible, because just because you are entitled to vote doesn't mean you should exercise that power. And boy, oh boy, did he change course again in 2016 when Trump got elected. And now all of a sudden, all these people who were saying, well, he's a danger, he's a threat, they were enemies of the people and they weren't respecting the people's wishes, right? So not a man who is deeply concerned with internal consistency when internal consistency gets in the way of ideological outcomes that he thinks are preferable.
And that kind of brings us to a wider point. I don't draw a strict line between being an academic and being a political person. Sure. I think both things are good. But he gets credibility as being this sort of like fusty academic. But I mean, he's at the Hoover Institution, right? Like this is a political writer we're talking about as much as an academic, or if not more so.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the really fun things about his writing is he will routinely chastise other academics for speaking outside of their disciplinary oeuvre. This was true in Social Justice Fallacies. It was true in Intellectuals in Society. And actually, he took aim at Noam Chomsky in particular in an interview on this point, where he's like, just because you're an expert in one domain doesn't give you the kind of slightest credibility in any other. And the intimation is, people should stay in their lanes, right? Except, again, Sowell is not really all that concerned with consistency when it comes to staying within his own disciplinary lane. Because while he will write about economic issues at great length, he's also weighed in everything like psychometrics, history, military strategy, electoral strategy, race and IQ, right? Various kinds of culture issues. He has a whole book called Race and Culture. Obviously talks about the role of intellectuals in society, and I could go on and on and on and on and on about this. And the reason why he's interested in all these things, I argue, is that Sowell is a man who is fundamentally committed to the idea that people are different, right? Economics is one expression of that, but it is not the only expression, and it's in some ways just the best one, because there's a kind of unsentimental quality he associates with economics that you can't find in other different disciplines. But the reason that he's interested in difference is he follows a long line of conservative thinkers like Edmund Burke, and I argue, even Sowell's own hero, like Robert Bark, in arguing that people are different in a way that makes them unequal, right? A janitor is different than a CEO in a very fundamental way, in that, the CEO is entitled to a lot more status, more wealth, more power in society, by virtue of being, as Hayek would put it in his essay on why he was not a conservative, the CEO is a recognizably superior person. And so it really needs to venture into all of these different disciplines to explain why these inequitable disciplines emerge in many different fields of human life. So his work is really a kind of vulgar tapestry of all the ways in which some people are superior to others, better than others. Cultures are, more developed than others. Societies are more affluent and more powerful than others. And all this is taken by him to be not only natural, but necessary for a kind of good society to appear.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's important to So, I mean, actually another point I want to ask you about is the response to this. Because people are a little bit sensitive. They hold Sowell a little bit dear, I think. And I wonder, like, part of me feels bad because I think a lot of guys convince themselves to read basic economics and thought of themselves like, this is basically a textbook for that, like any an objective look at how economic reality operates. And it's simply not that. I'm curious how because again, like, you do need to put a little bit of sugar on this for folks, but also I think that's almost the wrong message. People do need to confront the fact that like a Charles Murray, I saw Lex Friedman mention Charles Murray's bell curve as the most controversial work of science in the past, and it's like he's a think tank guy, right? Like he's not a scientist. I mean, just talk about like any message to somebody who thought you might be maybe a little bit too harsh on Sowell.
Well, I will throw a little sugar on this, just because I read so much of the guy, and I'm not going to lie, it gave me a fucking headache near the end of it, and when I was reading Intellectuals in Society in particular, I seriously thought at points about how watching the grass grow would be more interesting than him just complaining over and over again about the same things for the umpteenth time. But credit where he's due. He's a smart guy. There's no denying that, right? He's very erudite. He does write quite well, oftentimes, very repetitively. But that also might just be a function of the fact that I read so much of his work, so it all just started to blur together, right? And in some respects, he was a Marxist for a long time, and at its best, his writings still display a kind of critical distrust of power. In this case, the kind of power that is wielded by liberal elites in particular, that even a leftist might feel a bit of sympathy for at points, because Hillary Clinton isn't exactly somebody that we want to vote for. And it is the case that she often does not have the lower order's interests at heart, right? But that's about as far as it goes, I would argue, in terms of the sugar that I'm willing to put on this. The reality is, as I said, that he is pretty much a by-the-numbers conservative who follows the movements of the broader conservative wing of American society relatively thoughtlessly, and offers polemical support for whatever positions it happens to hold at any given time, sometimes without really even a great deal of understanding of what those positions are. I mean, one of the examples that I gave in the book, in the piece that I wrote about him, is he tried to offer this defense of Scalian originalism, and then he would point out figures like, well, William Blackstone and Oliver Wendell Holmes and Robert Bark all argue, that we should stick close to the text of, any given constitution or legal order when deciding what the law is going to be, which demonstrates that he really does not know anything about William Blackstone, who really emphasized the importance of precedent in shaping the unwritten British Constitution, or Oliver Wendell Holmes was famously a legal realist, right, who used to say, judges are the ones that make law, right? Yes, they are sometimes bound by the text, but for the most part, they creatively shape the text, including to suit social needs, whatever those happen to be at a given point, right? And the reason why he just decided to double down on this point is because he wasn't really all that knowledgeable about these legal issues. It's just that this is what the conservative moment held to be in vogue when he ended up writing Intellectuals in Society. So by God, that was what he was going to defend. Pretty poorly, I should add, right? So for people who will describe him as the greatest philosopher of the 21st century or a genius, I'm even willing to say, and here I'll be generous to conservatives, go read somebody like Roger Scruton, for example, a really creative conservative intellectual. I obviously have profound disagreements with him, but at the very least, he had something novel or unique to say and would sometimes be brave enough to challenge right-wing dogmas, whatever those are. Sowell, whatever else you want to call him, is a company man through and through, and he's probably going to end as a company man through and through.
Yeah, that level of erudition, it strikes me, can be pretty dangerous, because you can weave in sort of, I'm referencing, Constantinople, and I'm referencing all these things, and like to a guy who maybe you have time to read like 10 books a year, which is good if that's like,
totally.
You don't have the ability though to review, like, is he actually, what he's saying about this, are they oversweeping generalizations in service of a political project? Like it's actually, it takes a lot of sort of research into that. And, he, like you say, like Sowell isn't the type of guy who is going to make sure that you are informed. He wants you to come down with the right conclusions on these things.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And I want to say that, if you are not able to cross-reference everything that it talks about, which no one is, that's fine, because I'm very happy, as you pointed out, that there are a lot of really good leftist critics who are emerging, people like Nate Robinson or Unlearning Economics, who are doing a lot of the hard work for you, if that's what you're looking for. So my recommendation would be, go read Nathan's piece in Currents Affairs, go watch the Unlearning Economics video, which I plan on doing actually immediately after this is done, when I go to the gym, and, they'll do a lot of that kind of legwork for you.
Really, I watched the Unlearning Economics video yesterday, and I was shocked that I'm like, this is very relevant. Did they look at my DMs with McManus? And it actually just posted. But yeah, it really actually does go into some of his claims. And I'll link that in this alongside Matt's piece, which is Thomas Sowell is a cynical man in Jacobin. Matt, thanks so much for joining me once again.
Anytime, buddy. It was great talking to you.